Hi, 8th grade girls. We're going on to the next chapter in social studies today, which is other events of Jefferson's presidency. So we just talked about Lewis and Clark in the last chapter, and now we're moving forward into War of 1812, the Alamo, all of those things that helped to the continuation of gaining land for America. So we are on page 153 in your social studies textbook. We're going to look first at the presidential profile on the bottom of the page, which is Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826. He was president from 1801 to 1809. His vice presidents were Aaron Burr for the first term and George Clinton in the second term. He was the Democratic/Republican political party. States of residence when he was elected: Virginia. Remembered for writing the Declaration of Independence. It's a pretty big deal. Major events during his presidency: the Louisiana Purchase and Ohio statehood in 1803, and the invention of the steamboat in 1807. Hamilton's death. In July of 1804, the nation mourned the loss of Alexander Hamilton, one of our founding fathers and the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton's death in a duel with Aaron Burr, Jefferson's vice president. The two had many personal and political arguments. Hamilton fired the first shot, but he fired into the air because he wanted to end the duel without bloodshed. Burr fired at Hamilton, who fell mortally wounded. The duel ended Burr's political career. Barbary pirates. American merchant ships trading in the Mediterranean Sea had to pay an annual tribute to the Barbary pirates, who controlled the northern shore of Africa. Ships that refused were looted, and their crews were held for ransom. When, in 1801, the rulers of Tripoli demanded a large tribute, President Jefferson sent American warships to the Mediterranean. After the American warships bombarded the coast of Tripoli in 1805, that nation decided to make peace. As a result, the United States no longer paid tribute to Tripoli. Trouble with Britain and France. Neutrality. In 1803, Great Britain and France went to war. President Jefferson proclaimed a policy of neutrality, meaning that the United States would not take sides in the conflict. Neutral nations have the right to free trade on the seas. Ignoring Jefferson's policy, British warships seized and sank American ships trading with France, while the French took similar actions against American ships bound for Britain. Impressment. The conflict worsened when the British Navy began capturing American ships and impress American sailors, forcing them to serve on British warships. Because some English sailors were deserting to American ships and trying to pass as Americans, the British Navy reasoned that they had the right to search the American ships for deserters, meaning British soldiers who no longer wanted to fight for Britain and were trying to pose themselves as Americans to get out of the fight. In June of 1807, the British warship Leopard stopped the American warship Chesapeake just off the coast of Virginia. When the captain of the Chesapeake denied having British deserters in his crew and refused to submit to a search, the Leopard opened fire, killing 3 American sailors. The Chesapeake surrendered to a search, and the British seized 4 sailors, only one of them who was actually British. Embargo. President Jefferson did not want to go to war with either the British or the French. Instead, he asked Congress to pass the Embargo Act of 1807. An Embargo Act is the limiting or stopping trade with other nations. The Embargo Act stopped all trade with Europe. President Jefferson reasoned that France and England would come to their own senses once they realized how much they needed American products. Instead, the French and the British found other sources for their needs. Because many Americans depended on the trade with Europe, the embargo caused an economic depression in the United States. So they were doing this to try and say, see how much you need us? Turns out, nope, we can just get that stuff somewhere else. And then America fell into a huge economic slump because they weren't getting that money from Europe that they needed. The War of 1812. Steps towards war. Repealing the embargo. Before President Jefferson left office, the Federalists in Congress repealed the embargo. The Federalist Party dominated the New England states, which had suffered the most from the embargo. Limiting the embargo rewarded American trade with British and France, but it did not stop harassment of American shipping. War hawks. A group of congressmen from the southern and western states began to call for war with Great Britain. They called themselves war hawks. The new Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, a leading war hawk representing Kentucky, warned that the Canadian British were stirring up the Indians to attack the settlers in the West. The election of 1809. James Madison of Virginia came to the presidency in 1809 in the midst of rising conflict. Like Jefferson, Madison was a member of the Democratic Republican Party. He also played an important role in the framing of the U.S. Constitution, earning the title Father of the Constitution. His wife, Dolly Madison, had already served 8 years as the official hostess for President Jefferson, a widower. Dolly Madison would serve as First Lady for a total of 16 years. So official hostess for the president means he didn't have a wife, and in those days the wife would be the host, would host parties, would host dinner. Anytime people would come over, she would be the host. And so because he didn't have a wife, he had no one to host people at the White House. And so Dolly Madison acted as his host, not as his wife, because she was married, but as the host of the White House. Tecumseh, superstition leads to disaster. The Prophet. Around 1811, an Indian cult leader known as the Prophet learned from Canadian traders that a solar eclipse would occur on a certain day. On the appointed day of the eclipse, the prophet stood up and proclaimed that he would darken the sun and then bring it back to life. Of course, the superstitious tribe did not know what caused the eclipse, but it appeared to them that the prophet had power over life and death. Tecumseh and the New Madrid quake. While the prophet gathered thousands of Indians to his headquarters on the banks of the Tippecanoe River, the Wabash River in the northern Indiana Territory, his brother, Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief, began to organize the tribes for war against American settlers west of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1811, Tecumseh traveled down the Mississippi River and stirred up the Indian nations of the South, meaning got them riled up and ready for war and giving them reason to think, yes, we need to attack the Americans, and here's why. That same year, a powerful earthquake shook the lower Mississippi Valley, changing the course of the river. The New Madrid quake, so named because it was centered near the town of New Madrid, Missouri, was perhaps the most violent earthquake in American history. Once again, superstition prevailed among the Indians. They believed that the earthquake was a sign from their gods. Both Tecumseh and the prophet urged the Indians to massacre American settlers. Arms from British Canada. Meanwhile, fur traders from Canada began to supply the Indians with guns. The American settlers had no real proof that the British government approved of this activity, but many feared that the invasion from Canada would begin after the Indians launched the war. American farmers made plans to protect their homes and families. The Battle of Tippecanoe. The governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, decided to act before the Indians gained further strength. Taking 1,000 soldiers, he marched on the headquarters of the prophet. The Battle of Tippecanoe, Harrison and his troops defeated the Indians. The War of 1812 begins. The problem in the West. By the summer of 1812, the British Parliament had decided that the situation on the high seas was not worth a war with America. But before news of this decision could reach the United States, President Madison asked Congress to declare war. British fur traders in Canada had already stirred up the Indians along the Ohio River and around the Great Lakes against the American settlers. Tecumseh had rallied the tribes with fresh arms and a promise of British troops from Canada if war should break out. Scattered Indians, massacres of American settlers in the territories west of the Appalachians now occurred with British backing. Thus, the War of 1812 began in June of 1812. Battles at sea. Early in the war, America saw surprising victories on the high seas. With fewer than 20 ships to the British 800 ships, the American Navy was greatly outnumbered, but most of the British ships were needed to fight the French. On July 19, 1812, the British warship Guerriere and the American Constitution, we've heard of that one, met for battle in the mid-Atlantic. The Constitution, under the command of Captain Isaac Hull, defeated and destroyed the Guerriere. In December, the Constitution met and destroyed the battleship Java off the coast of Brazil. Cannonballs fired at the Constitution appeared to bounce off her heavy oaken sides. These victories won the ship the nickname Old Ironsides. Battles with the British and the Indians. British defeat and Tecumseh's death. The British planned to invade the United States from 3 directions. First, an army would march south from Canada. Early in 1812, Canada had been unsuccessfully invaded by 3 American armies. The first phase of the British invasion failed when the American Navy won control of the Great Lakes. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry decidedly defeated the British Great Lakes fleets at the Battle of Lake Erie on September 10th, 1813. Afterward, he sent his simple message to General William Henry Harrison. "We have met the enemy and they are ours." General Harrison also won a victory over Indian war parties and British troops at the Battle of the Thames River on October 5th, near southern Ontario. Tecumseh was killed in this battle. His death symbolized the close of an era for the eastern woodland tribes. Andrew Jackson and the Creeks. In Alabama, the Creek Indians, who had earlier been stirred up by Tecumseh, attacked Fort Mims and killed many pioneer families. The citizens of Nashville, fearing an Indian attack on their community, agreed to send a band of Tennessee riflemen under Andrew Jackson to pursue the Indians. The Tennesseans met and defeated the Creek Indians at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. After the massacre at Fort Mims, Alabama, settlers supported the removal of Indians to the land farther west. Washington, D.C. burned. The war now shifted to the east, where the British saw more success. In the second phase of their attack, British forces attempted to isolate the northern states from the southern states. On August 24, 1814, they caught the Americans off guard at Washington, D.C. The British appeared in the capital so suddenly that the President and First Lady were interrupted at their dinner table by the cry of alarm. Dolly Madison snatched the valuable silverware from the table and arranged to have a cherished portrait of George Washington carried to safety. It was widely reported at the time that British officers finished eating the president's dinner before they burned the presidential mansion. The British also burned the Capitol building in retaliation for the burning of the Canadian capital of York, now Toronto, Ontario, by the Americans on May 1st, 1813. The Star-Spangled Banner. After the burning of the Capitol, the British Army marched to the port of Baltimore, Maryland, where the United States Army forced them to retreat to their ships. The British Navy bombarded Fort McHenry, the main fort at Baltimore. Throughout the night of September 13, 1814, a young patriot, Francis Scott Key, had boarded one of the British vessels to negotiate the release of an American prisoner. That night, he watched the bombardment of the fort and later came out on deck in the dawn's early light to see the American flag still flew on the fort. The British had failed. Inspired by the battle-scarred flag, Key wrote a poem which was later set to music and became our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. The British plan to split the United States in half at Baltimore had failed, but they still hoped to strike a fatal blow in the South. The Battle of New Orleans. The third and last phase of the British attack took place in the West with the invasion of New Orleans on January 8, 1815. As the British force of 7,500 men advanced on New Orleans, they met General Andrew Jackson, who led a force of Tennessee riflemen, Kentucky militia, local blacks, Creoles, people of Spanish and French ancestry, and Bayou pirates. Jackson's men fought hard and well, and the British retreated with heavy losses. The Battle of New Orleans was the last great battle of the War of 1812. The war had actually ended 2 weeks before with the Treaty of Ghent, signed in Europe in December of 1814. Due to the slowness of communication, the troops on both sides thought they were still at war. Andrew Jackson became a national hero. The Hartford Convention. Federalist leaders in New England had opposed war with England from the very beginning. In December 1814, a convention of delegates met in Hartford, Connecticut. In what became known as the Hartford Convention, delegates condemned the war and declared the right of the state to nullify or repeal an act of Congress. They blamed the war hawks for the South and West for starting the war. The war ended before any national problems resulted from the decisions made at Hartford. The convention was significant because it gave rise to the issue of states' rights, as opposed to the power of the national government. Results of the War of 1812. The immediate result of the conflict between the United States and Great Britain was a newfound respect for one another's claims in North America. In the future, the United States and Britain would work together peacefully to resolve any conflicts over Western lands. They would stand united against claims of all other foreign powers. The settlements of the American West could continue without the threat of a more major foreign war. The war also spurred the growth of manufacturing in the Northeast. Because the long conflict kept Americans from importing goods from English and European factories, the New England area began to develop its own factories. The Industrial Revolution had come to America. Also, the president's mansion in Washington, D.C. became known as the White House. When it was burned in 1812, the limestone walls were blackened by smoke. A clean coat of paint, white paint, both inside and out, hid the damage. With the white paint so generously applied, it did not take long for someone to refer to the president's home as the White House. The name stuck and has remained ever since. For your questions for today: who killed Alexander Hamilton? Who imposed the Embargo Act of 1807? What did this act do? How did Dolly Madison serve President Jefferson during his years in office? What did the prophet learn from the Canadian traders that made him appear to be a prophet? What was the New Madrid quake? How did the Indians view this quake? Who won the Battle of Tippecanoe? How many warships did American Navy have? What ship was called Old Ironsides, and why? Who defeated the British in the Great Lakes? Name the battle. What did the British do to the White House and Capitol building? Why? Who wrote the poem The Star-Spangled Banner? When and where? Name the last great battle of the War of 1812. Why was the battle unnecessary? Give at least 3 results of the War of 1812. And some things to identify: Barbary pirates, Impress, Warhawks, Henry Clay, James Madison, Tecumseh, Battle of Thames River, Creeks, Fort Mims, Andrew Jackson, Battle of Horseshoe Bend, York, Treaty of Ghent, Hartford Convention, Nullify, and White House. Next time, we'll go on to the next section, which is an expanding nation. We're going to go on to the Virginia Dynasty. We're going to talk about the United States gaining Florida from Spain, and new presidents as we continue to move forward into a nation from Atlantic to Pacific.